against a just transition, I think, is as yet uncertain, but so far anyway, it looks like in the short term, land will play quite a significant role because there is an expectation that offsetting will be a significant part of the short term mix of things that needs to happen. Now that's highly contentious. Plenty of people will happily, and no doubt will this afternoon, be very keen to say that offsetting should not be part of a transition. The expectation that offsetting may well be a significant part of it, and in fact it already is, but I think that there is a mechanism for ensuring that what is happening with offsetting, or what is happening with natural capital more generally, is in the public interest and not just a kind of free-for-all for spectators. So that's our role specifically.
So there's very many definitions about the just transition, and I'm interested now in how the Scottish Land Commission defines what a just transition is.
So I don't think we should define what the word just means. You know what? The transition that has been set out by government is a transition to net zero. So that's not for us to define. The question of what does just look like? Well, every single citizen in Scotland will have a view about that. So there's probably about 5 million different views of what a just transition should look like. What I think matters is that the transition is supported by the Scottish people through democratic channels, and that will suggest that the majority of the Scottish people consider it to be just. But there is no, I think it would be foolish to try and say there is an objective definition of just, far less just transition. I don't think such a thing exists.
How would you define a just transition?
Well, the Scottish Government do define a just transition. So the Scottish Government, their definition is a just transition covers a variety of social interventions to support jobs and livelihoods, especially focused on carbon-intensive regions and industries. So that's fairly narrow, but it's a lot broader than other people have defined a just transition, because if a just transition could be very broad, saying it's society moving to net zero, but that's kind of meaningless. And the Scottish Government have attempted in some way kind of make it regional and to look at specific sectors. So they're kind of hedging a little bit. It's not very broad and it's not really narrow, but it's kind of in the middle. But when you look at the strategy papers around a just transition the Scottish Government was one of the first governments in the world to start using just transition. And I think the first time we saw it was 2017. The UK government first used it in August last year. And they wanted to make sure there was a just transition for the financial services sector. So their definition of just transition was very different from what the Scottish Government have been saying. But the Scottish Government's variation of just transition is very different from the European Union and other countries and other definitions. So I agree, I think it's really difficult. It's like that sustainable. How do you define sustainability? But they've attempted to do it. But the strategy papers that have looked at it in practice have covered from a whole variety of different angles. So I think the Scottish Government said to the to government, this is where it is. How would you implement this wide strategy? And you can see how deeply it's attempting to be implemented across the Scottish Government.
At the same time, I agree with both your interpretations, but at the same time, is the commonality point here that a just transition is basically a plan for transition into a green economy, and that can have various interpretations, but doing so in a way which acknowledges that there may be winners and losers from that, and that you need a plan for accounting for those winners and losers and making sure that it's fair, effectively. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes, but the problem is, what does fair mean?
Same as just.
The same as just, exactly. So I think we have to be pretty clear. The Scottish people will decide whether this is fair, and the Scottish people will decide whether this is just. And if they don't think it is, they'll almost certainly take action through the ballot box. And so I don't actually think this is all that different from sustainability. People talk about the three pillars of sustainability: social, economic, and environmental. And they completely forget the fourth, which is political. If it's not politically sustainable in a democracy, then you've lost the plot.
I think the danger is that we look at it as being the same as sustainability, and I think it's got to be very different to sustainability. And when I read nearly 30 of the strategy documents that covered just transition, and almost nowhere in those documents was there anything about redistribution. And I think a just transition, with the broadest definition, is about how do you redistribute the benefits of a transition to a new economy. And the Scottish Government, I don't even think is giving it lip service, because I think there's still an expectation that this new economy will grow and everyone will do really well out of this new economy. So we don't need to think about redistribution. And this is the trickle down, levelling up agenda that we've seen. And in my paper, I said this is so similar to what I remember when I was growing up in the 80s. That it would be fine because we'd have these transitions, but overall, London and the financial services would bring all this money in and you would get it back. And I just couldn't see the structural difference between that transition and the digital transition that's happening now, and this idea of a just transition. I read through these papers, and at the end of it, I thought, it's fantastic, because the Scottish Government have found a silver bullet. The climate change plan suggests that Scotland will benefit from and capture the opportunities of net zero. Scotland's retail strategy suggests that the shared net zero goals will ensure the sector's future success. The draft hydrogen action plan maintains that Scotland has the opportunity and ability to benefit from a just transition by becoming an exporter of hydrogen, and will create and protect new jobs and generate significant economic opportunities for communities across Scotland. The ministerial foreword by Scotland's Cabinet Secretary for Finance in the Making Scotland's Future states that the digital transformation and the low carbon production of a just transition will boost companies' productivity and profitability. So it looks like this transition is going to be fantastic for the Scottish economy, and it looks like it's a silver bullet, and I've obviously got a few problems when we're looking at it.
Thank you. Just on the definition of a just transition, the Scottish Government set up Scottish Climate Assembly, and I was one of the members of it. And this is our final report that was submitted to the Parliament in May 21. And the question that we were given to deal with was, how should Scotland change to tackle the climate emergency in an effective and fair way? Which I thought was quite a reasonable definition of a just transition to be effective and fair. Incidentally, of the recommendations that we made, 25% were accepted, and the other 75% were either rejected or very partially accepted.
Well, the Just Transition Commission, which was, I think it had a similar brief, they made 25 recommendations, and all 25, or not, 28, and all 28 of them were accepted. So it's really interesting to see that the Citizens' Assembly had that much lower effective push through to government than the commission set up by government.
Maybe we were trying to set a higher bar.
Possibly.
It will now cost you more to buy degraded peatland than to buy peatland in good condition. There's a belief that you'll get more carbon credits out of it. People are being priced out of land. Family farms, people are being priced out of farmland. They've been planted up to trees because people think they'll get carbon credits. Communities can no longer buy land because the price has gone so high that the land fund can't afford it.
That's not fair.
So
Or just.
Of course, given the job I do and given the things I believe, I would say that's not fair and not just. Other people would say it's perfectly just.
So one thing we can and we shouldn't do, and I think what we're doing already, unfortunately, is to give this over to the market. because that's what we did with the industrial transformation in the 80s. We said to people, you've not got a job now, but the market will decide if you need training and then you'll find another job. And I think that's the route that we're going down. And one of the things I picked up from reading all of the papers was that there was a heavy reliance on the market to support a just transition. And again, for people who are maybe old enough, it looked like what the Conservative government was saying in the 80s. The market will solve these problems and we shouldn't really worry about it. And that came across really strongly in the papers, that the market seemed to be a solution for so many aspects of a just transition.
So, William, SCOTONOMICS published its first report on a just transition last month. Can you give us the key findings on that?
Yes, so breaking it down into three things. Primarily, the United Kingdom, within the United Kingdom, the Scottish Government is a currency user and it doesn't issue its own currency. And if you really want to try and transform an economy, trying to do it with so few economic powers is incredibly difficult. I mean, I think it's absolutely impossible, but it's incredibly difficult. And this, in a way, leads to one of the reasons why you see the Scottish Government going to the market. And Amanda was saying earlier, we maybe could have got a share in some of these energy companies, and I think she's right with that. But ostensibly they're saying we need private finance because we can't release our own money, our own currency into this economy. So what they were saying they could do, when you look at the powers to do it, it just didn't match up in any way. And my kind of summary was that the Scottish Government's taken on all of the responsibility of a just transition, doesn't have any of the authority for this. And politically, that looks incredibly naive. And I think if we're moving towards an independence campaign, I think you want a government that says, this is what we want to do, but we can't do it, and we can only do this. But when you look at the strategy documents, including the big one that came out last summer, which is the Scottish National Economic Transition, it said that Scotland is aiming for a significant increase on GDP over the last 10 years. Now, for any government, any sub-national government to make that claim, I think is ridiculous. But this is what the Scottish Government are pushing out, that we can rise, whether or not we should focus on GDP, I think is another conversation, but that we can push this just transition that does all these wonderful things without our own currency or without the economic powers. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that the Scottish Government hasn't realised that you can't have everything. You can't, and there's a lot of evidence in the report, that you can't have significant GDP growth and reduce your emissions by the 10 to 12% annual emissions that we've got to have. There's no evidence that that can be done, but there's no recognition of that within the paper. So I've said that they really have to decide, and I think the Scottish Government has to say growth or not growth, or lowering emissions and not growth, but they have to start making these difficult decisions. And then the third thing, as I've kind of alluded to, was this involvement of the markets, and we kind of called it cask strength capitalism, because that's what we think. There's a reliance, go to the market first, and if we could touch on carbon capture, I think that's a perfect example of just leaving it to the market and allowing the market to sort things out. So that was our three findings that came out of that. But a just transition for me is about having a society that relies much more, is moving towards well-being and starts creating much more focused on community and care and these other types of jobs. And the conversation is always about people who are in oil and gas need to go and get a job making wind turbines. And I think that misses the whole underlying importance of what a just transition actually is. And often when I have this conversation about a just transition, it's just focusing on this bit. And for me, this is not the systemic change that we need to address from a just transition. This is, we've got a system, we need to change it. This is still tweaking around the edges. This isn't thinking about the rules of the game or the change in the paradigm. It's still thinking, well, you'll just make this thing over here, which still takes loads of energy and consumes loads of materials. It's not looking at the the economy very differently. And there's certain definitions of the just transition, but this is what they say a just transition is: a move to a very different type of economy. And I don't think that, well, that's certainly not the case within the UK government by any stretch of the imagination, and the Scottish government is infinitely better in saying it's what it wants to do. But I challenge you all, can you give me a policy that the Scottish government have introduced that fits really clearly under the definition of moving to a more fairer and a just economy? It needs to come through to policy.
We're going to take the Scottish people with us, and that's going to be quite tough, actually. And I guess that's why So setting it, I mean, I'm a pragmatist from the point of view of the Land Commission. The Land Commission's got a job to do. It's got to do it today and tomorrow and the next day. And we need to keep doing it, and we need to adapt that as the world adapts around us. So that's my pragmatic Land Commission point. But I think more generally, I think it will, in reality, be incremental.
What used to be the case in Scotland until about 1860, when the Tory government of the day got rid of it, which was a tax on land ownership. The Danes do it, and there's only 2 people in Scotland.
Tax on land ownership?
Yes.
Well, land tax.
A land tax. Now, the Danes do it. There are 2 very large Danish landowners who have large land ownership in Scotland, and they pay tax on it. But they pay it to the Danish government, not to ours.
You've been quite strong in that, haven't you? You've said in land tax.
We've been very clear that the land value needs to be brought into the taxation system. So we've made that. And interestingly, I think it was last week, there was a report published in Westminster saying exactly the same for south of the border. So we published a year ago and said exactly that. And last week, Westminster followed suit. So on the land tax, I don't think there's any argument. It's a matter for government, but argument.
There's no mention of land tax in any of the strategy papers on just
Cowardice, basically.
Just a quick comment. Is it right that land value tax is not covered under reserved powers? Is that something that Holyrood would have?
Well, so I'm not sure of the ins and outs of the. I mean, the Scottish government certainly has some powers in this. It's not all. It hasn't got all the powers. Some powers. On the council, just very quickly on the council tax. Well, of course, Wales has double council,
Exactly.
so that can be done. Yeah.
I think in terms of the kind of Barnett consequential stuff, is my understanding is that anything that the local authorities earn is theirs. So if the Scottish land tax was collected by Holyrood, then it would lose its Barnett's consequentials. But if local authorities collected land tax, which seems like a fantastic idea for so many reasons, we would get over that. It was explained to me by an economist at the Scottish government that's kind of. It's slightly opaque, but that's basically broadly the situation.
We need to grow more food in this country, and I'm not sure, is it your experience that the land available for being productively farmed agriculturally is decreasing or not?
So yes, and we will be publishing shortly a further update of our land market report. There is no question that land is going out of food production and into carbon capture at the moment. Now, absolutely, there's an argument about whether that's a good thing or not, and different people will have different points of view, but it's happening. And our job is to report that it's happening, and where appropriate, to report mechanisms for ensuring that the people of Scotland can decide whether it should happen.
So we were speaking to someone earlier about they work in financial services, and I said we would think that financial services as a sector is too big, and in a just transition that would probably shrink. And I'm thinking that's my job that you're talking about, So I think you have to be really comfortable and confident to have those discussions. But if at the end of it you can't say, and we can't really help you because we don't have enough of the powers in Scotland. That's such a weak position to be able to say, and it makes it really, really difficult. But my comment on the food, and it'd be great. I know we haven't really got much more time, but it'd be great to cover about what our land's being used for in Scotland. Because one thing we do not lack in Scotland is land. There's nobody here Right? There's so much land, but we've moved, you know, and as someone who's training to be an ecological economist, what we would say is it's really important that when you look at economy that you've three sectors. So you need a land sector, you need resources, you need a sector that's putting all those resources into play, and then you need a third sector to actually do stuff with it. And since the 80s, we've moved from this kind of primary resource, we've really moved from secondary, and we're in this kind of delivering services, and mainly financial services. And land is the perfect example. We've now got land, we're building trees on it, so we can financialise the assets that are being developed here, not actually turning that into something really, really productive. And I know a lot of those trees will be turned into useful things, but they shouldn't be. You're not allowed to turn trees into something if you're claiming carbon credits on it. So it's really complicated, but I think that talks to much more about our structure of the economy. And my final point is that when we're looking for solutions, incremental is really important, but we're not going to get change unless we start looking at really big changes.
To our guests then.